I cheated on the love of my life, Threesome, he suggested. You'll probably decide who the villain is before this story even really starts. I blamed the threesome too. It was easier than admitting the truth. The truth is, the weekend didn't ruin my relationship. I did.
I cheated on the love of my life after the threesome, he suggested. If that's all you hear, you'll probably decide who the villain is before this story even really starts. I wouldn't blame you. For a long time, I blamed the threesome too. It was easier than admitting the truth. The truth is, the weekend didn't ruin my relationship. I did. Not that night. Not all at once. Just one small choice at a time until there wasn't enough of us left to save. And before you decide Micah made some huge mistake by asking for what he asked, I need you to know something. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't manipulative. He wasn't trying to fix a broken relationship. If anything, he trusted us more than either of us realized. That's why this story still hurts. Because the worst thing that happened to us wasn't what we chose together. It was what I chose afterward. So let me start where all the worst stories usually begin, with two people who were genuinely happy. What we were. His name was Micah. Call me Damie, not my real name, but close enough for a story. We met the way a lot of people our age meet now, completely by accident. A mutual friend's birthday dinner. I showed up late. The only empty seat was next to him. I'd spent weeks telling everyone I was done with dating after a messy breakup, so naturally the universe sat me beside the one man who would completely ruin that plan. Micah wasn't the loudest person in the room. He didn't have to be. He was the kind of person who made you feel like whatever you were saying actually mattered. Halfway through dinner, he asked me what I usually did on Sundays. Not what I did for work, not where I saw myself in 5 years. Just Sundays. And then he listened to my answer like it was important. By the end of the night, I'd somehow given him my number. Our first date was supposed to be coffee. It turned into 6 hours. Coffee became a walk. The walk became dinner. Dinner became him standing outside my apartment in the rain, because neither of us wanted to be the first one to say goodbye. When he kissed me, it was careful. Almost shy, like he was asking permission instead of assuming he already had it. I remember walking upstairs afterward thinking, oh no, this one's going to matter. I was right. The relationship itself wasn't dramatic. That was the beautiful part. It was built out of small things. He found a 20-minute Rain soundtrack after I casually mentioned I couldn't sleep without background noise. He sent it to me with one message. For my restless one. I still have that video saved. We moved in together after a year. People said it was too soon. It never felt that way. Whoever got home first would leave a single word on a sticky note on the fridge. No explanation, just one word. Hurricane. Tired. Victory. One Tuesday it simply said spaghetti. He refused to explain it for the next 2 years. Some days the note just said you. Those were always my favorite. The moment I realized I was probably going to love him forever was when he learned to cook my grandmother's stew. Not because anyone asked him to. I'd mentioned once, months earlier, that I missed it. Just once. He remembered. He video-called my grandmother, stumbled through 2 languages neither of them fully shared, butchered half the pronunciation, and somehow still managed to learn the recipe. By the end of the call she'd adopted him. That was Micah. He remembered the things I forgot I'd ever said. Was our relationship perfect? No. We argued over dishes. Whose turn it was to call his mother? Normal couple things. Once we had a ridiculous fight over something so small neither of us could remember what it was about halfway through arguing, and we ended up laughing instead of finishing the fight. Nothing ever felt broken. Nothing even felt cracked. Which is exactly why what happened afterward blindsided me. Because this wasn't a relationship that was dying. It was one I thought would last for the rest of my life. Here's the part that's going to surprise you, if you've heard stories like this before, and assumed you already knew the shape of it. It wasn't me who wanted to spice things up. It was Micah. I remember exactly where we were. His side of the couch, A Thursday night. Some show neither of us was actually watching anymore. Just background noise for the silence he was clearly building up the nerve to break. He'd been quiet in a specific way for about 20 minutes. The particular quiet he got when he was rehearsing something in his head before he let himself say it out loud. "Can I bring something up?" he said finally. "And you actually think about it before you answer, instead of just reacting." That alone should have told me this wasn't a small thing. Micah didn't usually need permission to talk to me about anything. "Okay," I said. "You're scaring me a little. Go." He laughed, nervous, and reached for my hand before he kept going, like he needed the anchor of it. He told me he loved me completely, made me promise, before he said another word, that I understood he wasn't leading up to some complaint, some crack he'd been hiding. He said he'd been thinking, for a while now, about the two of us having one experience together that belonged only to us. Something outside the normal shape of our life. Not because anything was missing, because things were this good, and he wanted one more thing that was only ours, chosen deliberately, from a place of feeling completely secure in what we already had. "I want us to try a threesome," he said, finally, plainly, once he'd built the whole runway toward it. Just once. Just us, deciding it together. I sat with it longer than I expected to. I want to be honest about my own reaction here too, because it matters later, more than I understood at the time. Something in me went quiet in a way it doesn't usually go quiet. Not fear exactly. Something closer to a held breath, the sensation right before you step off something high. "Talk me through why," I said. Not no, not yes, just genuinely why. He talked. He was careful and thoughtful about it, in a way that, looking back, still moves me. He'd clearly turned this over in his head for weeks before he ever said it out loud to me. He said he didn't want it because he was bored of me. And I believed him completely. Then and now. He said he wanted it because of how secure he felt, that it was almost a strange kind of tribute to how much he trusted what we had, that he wouldn't have dreamed of suggesting it to anyone he wasn't sure of. "If the answer's no," he said, "it's genuinely no big deal. I need you to know that before you answer. I'm not going to be weird about it either way." I believe that too. I still believe it. And I think that's exactly why I said yes. Not because I felt pressured, but because he'd made it so safe to say no that saying yes felt like the bigger, more generous thing to offer him. 2 years of good faith is a heavy thing to argue against, and I didn't actually want to argue against it. I wanted to give him this thing he'd been brave enough to ask for. "Okay," I said. "Yeah, let's do it." We talked about it properly over the following weeks, genuinely, carefully, more honestly than I think either of us expected going in. We wrote down, separately and then together, what we each actually wanted out of it, and what we absolutely didn't. We agreed it would happen somewhere away from home, a different city, a clean slate with none of the ghosts of our normal life hanging around the edges of it. We agreed on someone neither of us knew, well enough to have complicated history with, low stakes, low emotional residue, someone who could be present for one night and then simply not be part of our lives again. That's how Theo entered the story. A friend of a friend, easy laugh, easy to be around, the kind of charming that makes a room relax instead of tense up. We met him for a drink first, just the three of us, specifically to check the chemistry was real and not just theoretical on paper. It was easy, almost suspiciously easy. We laughed a lot. The conversation never once felt forced, and I remember walking home afterward feeling reassured instead of nervous, which in hindsight might have been exactly the wrong thing to feel. We booked the weekend for 3 weeks later. We drove up Friday afternoon. 3 hours. Most of it spent making fun of the podcast Micah insisted on playing, both of us more nervous than either of us said out loud. We checked into the hotel, and he immediately opened the curtains all the way, which he always did. Some small ritual of his I'd stopped noticing, until I didn't have it to notice anymore. We had dinner that night. Just the two of us first. A private joke between us about being nervous like it was our actual first date all over again. He held my hand under the table through the entire meal, thumb moving slowly over my knuckles the way he did when he was working through his own nerves without wanting to make a thing of it. "We can still not do this," I told him, halfway through dessert. "You know that, right? Right up until the actual moment." "I know," he said. "I want to. Do you?" And I said yes, and at the time I meant it completely. Theo joined us later that night, easy and warm the same way he'd been at the drink weeks before, nothing about him shifting once the stakes actually became real. I won't detail what happened after that. I'll tell you it was exactly what we'd planned it to be. Consensual, communicated, careful. Nothing that crossed a line the three of us hadn't already drawn together in advance, out loud, with actual words, days before it happened. What I will tell you about, in detail, is after. Micah fell asleep first, curled toward me, peaceful in a way that genuinely surprised me, not restless, not turning the night over anxiously in his head the way I might have expected, just settled. Like something in him had exhaled completely, all at once, after holding its breath for weeks leading up to that Thursday night conversation. I lay there next to him for a long time before I slept. Something in my own chest had gone very still, in a way I didn't have language for yet, and I remember trying to name it and failing, over and over, in the dark, while he breathed evenly beside me. I want to try to describe it as honestly as I can, because I've turned this exact moment over in my head more than any other single moment in this entire story, trying to actually understand it, instead of just feeling guilty about it in the abstract. It wasn't regret. It wasn't even really about Theo specifically. By the next morning I barely thought of him as a person at all, just a shape that had briefly been present. It was something closer to this. For one night, I'd existed slightly outside the edges of the life I'd built with Micah, and once I'd felt the outline of that other version of myself, the one who wanted things outside the shape of something that was already good, already enough for anyone with sense, I found I couldn't fully put him back down afterward. He'd opened a door in me I hadn't known was there, and once it was open, it didn't close all the way again, no matter how many times I told myself to shut it. We went home Sunday. Micah seemed lighter for weeks afterward, genuinely, uncomplicatedly lighter, like he'd gotten exactly what he'd wanted going into it. A shared story, proof of trust survived and rewarded, nothing more or less than that. He'd bring it up sometimes, casually, fondly, the way you'd reference an inside joke, and I kept smiling and nodding and agreeing that it had been good, that it had been exactly what he'd hoped for. I didn't tell him that some part of me hadn't come all the way back with us. Here's the thing nobody warns you about going into something like this. It's not always the person who suggests it who ends up changed by it. Micah got his closure clean and whole. I got a question I hadn't known to ask myself before, and it wouldn't stop asking itself, quietly, at the worst possible times, during dinner, during the sticky note mornings, during the exact ordinary happiness that used to be more than enough for me. I texted Theo 3 weeks later. Nothing that would have looked like anything if you'd read it over my shoulder. Just checking in, I told myself. Just being polite. The kind of sentence you use on yourself when you're already looking for the exit sign on an argument you haven't had with yourself yet. He texted back, easy as always. We talked for a while. I remember feeling almost proud of myself afterward for keeping it so contained, so harmless, such a small and reasonable thing. It didn't stay contained. Over the next 2 months I became someone I genuinely didn't recognize, and I want to walk you through that slowly, because I think the slowness is the actual horror of it more than any single dramatic moment. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in small, deniable increments, each one so minor on its own that I could tell myself, every single time, that it wasn't really anything. First, it was just texting, sporadic, easy to justify. Then it was texting that I made sure to answer only when Micah had left the room, which I told myself was just being considerate, not wanting to bore him with a conversation that wasn't about him. Then it was a work thing on a Tuesday that had nothing to do with work at all. I remember driving to meet Theo the first time, hands tight on the wheel, feeling something twist low in my stomach that I actively, deliberately chose to interpret as excitement instead of what it actually was. The specific, sour nausea of becoming a person you used to be certain you'd never become. I became careful in ways that should have humiliated me in the moment, and mostly just embarrassed me now, looking back. I started showering the second I got home, every single time, a habit so consistent it should have been its own confession sitting right out in the open. I started angling my phone face down on the table at dinner, a small, ugly motion, over and over, until it stopped even registering as a choice and just became muscle memory. I stopped falling asleep first, some part of me apparently standing guard unconsciously, over secrets even in the dark. One night, I remember this one specifically, because it's the one that still catches in my throat when I think about it. Micah left a sticky note on the fridge that just said, "Grateful." No context, the way we always did it. I stood in the kitchen holding it for a long time before he came home, and some small, honest part of me wanted to throw the entire thing away, tell him everything right then, before it went any further. I didn't. I put the note in the drawer where we kept all the old ones, next to months and months of you and hurricane, and the one that just said spaghetti, and I told him his stew was perfect that night, and I meant it, and I was also, at that exact moment, 3 days away from meeting Theo again. And here's the part I think is the actual center of this whole story, the part I need you to really sit with, because it's the part that never fits into the neat version people usually tell. I never once stopped loving Micah. Not for a single day of those 2 months. I came home to him every night, and meant every "I love you" I said to him at the door. I wasn't performing devotion while secretly checked out somewhere else in my head. I was fully, actually devoted, and doing this to him at the exact same time, which is a much harder thing to explain honestly than simple villainy would be. I wasn't choosing Theo over Micah, not even close. I was chasing something that had nothing to do with either of them specifically. Some restless, hungry thing in me that had woken up that weekend in the hotel and refused to go back to sleep, no matter how good the life sleeping right next to it still was. I told myself constantly that I would stop. Every single time felt, in the moment, like it was going to be the last one, that I'd quietly close this door and Micah would never have to know it had ever been open at all. I believed that every time I said it to myself. That's what I need you to understand. If you're going to understand any of this, the lie was never a plan. It was a loop, and I kept telling myself I was one more turn away from stepping off it. He noticed before I confessed. Of course he did. I wasn't half as careful as I thought I was. I was just banking, without fully admitting it to myself, on him loving me too much to look closely, which is its own particular kind of cruelty, using someone's trust in you as camouflage against their own instincts. I noticed the shift in him about a week before it actually broke. He got quieter at dinner. He stopped leaving sticky notes for a few days, which had never happened once in 2 years, and when I asked him about it, he just said he'd been busy, in a tone that didn't match the words at all. I told myself it was work stress. I told myself a lot of things that week. It came apart on an ordinary Wednesday. I remember that specifically, because I'd spent so long imagining how this moment might eventually happen, in some vague, hypothetical, someday far-off way, and none of my imagined versions looked anything like a Wednesday. I'd gone out to meet a friend, a real friend. That part was true, and my phone had stayed behind on the kitchen counter, screen up, because I'd gotten careless, in exactly the way you get careless once you've gotten away with something long enough to start believing you're actually good at it. Micah wasn't checking my phone. I want to say that clearly, because it matters to who he is as a person, even after everything that came next. A message just came through while it sat there face up on the counter, and it lit the screen, and he happened to be standing close enough, reaching for his charger, to see Theo's name attached to it, along with just enough of the message underneath to understand exactly what he was looking at. I came home a little after 10. He was sitting at our kitchen table, my phone in front of him, screen still faintly lit. He wasn't crying, he wasn't yelling. That was somehow worse than either would have been. He just looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before in 2 years. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Something closer to the specific, terrible stillness of someone recalculating everything they thought they'd understood about their own life in real time. "Sit down," he said. "Quiet. Level." I sat. "How long?" he said. Not even really phrased as a question, just 2 words flat, waiting for me to fill the space underneath them. I told him the truth. All of it, all at once. I didn't try to minimize it or soften the timeline. And I think that's the only thing I did entirely right in that whole conversation. I didn't make him drag it out of me piece by piece across an hour of half answers. I just said it, the texting, the meetups, the 2 months of it, start to finish, while I watched something in his face fold inward with every sentence. 2 months, he repeated, mostly to himself. 2 months of sticky notes. 2 months of you saying you loved me at that door. "I did," I said. "I do. That's the part I need you to hear." "Don't," he said, not sharp, just tired, bone-tired, in a way I'd never heard from him. "Don't do the part where you explain how you loved me the whole time. I believe you. That's actually the part that's breaking me right now, if you want to know the truth. I'd almost rather you didn't." We sat in that for a long minute. Then he asked me the question I think about more than any other single sentence in this entire story. "Was it the weekend?" he said, quiet, almost afraid of the answer. "Did I do this? Did I open something in you that wasn't there before?" "I need you to really hear my answer because it's the entire point of me telling you any of this at all." I told him no. I told him the truth. That what happened that weekend wasn't the crack in us. It was just a door. And I was the one who chose to keep walking back through it, alone, over and over for 2 months straight, long after the door itself had stopped having anything to do with why I kept walking through it. He'd given us something honest and brave, asked for from a place of real security in what we had, and I had taken that gift and turned it into an excuse to become someone he couldn't trust. That was never on him. I said it then, at our kitchen table, with him looking at me like I was a stranger wearing someone he used to love. I'm saying it again now on the record, permanently, it was never on him. He asked me to leave that night. He didn't scream it, didn't throw anything, didn't do any of the things I think some smaller, more self-pitying part of me had almost braced for, some version of the scene that would have let me feel like the wronged party in my own guilt. He just said, "I need you to go," very calmly, and I packed a bag with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, and I left, because it was the only thing left that I actually still owed him. I found out much later, from a friend we both still talked to, that he cried for the better part of a week after I moved out, and never once in front of me. Even in the wreckage of what I'd done to him, some part of him had still chosen, instinctively, to protect me from having to watch him fall apart. I think about that more than almost anything else in this entire story. I'm not sure I deserve to think about it as often as I do. I want to tell you honestly what the next several months looked like for me, because I think this is the part most stories like mine skip entirely, the part where the person who did the damage actually has to sit inside it, instead of just moving smoothly on to someone new, and calling the moving on growth. I didn't handle it well at first. I want to be honest about that too. There were weeks where I told myself a much kinder version of the story than the true one, that it wasn't that serious, that people make mistakes, that Micah could stand to be a little less absolute about it, a little more willing to work through it instead of just closing the door. I'm not proud of those weeks. I include them anyway, because I think it's dishonest to pretend the growth was instant, or clean, or that I became a better person the exact second the apartment door shut behind me. What actually changed it was a much smaller moment than I expected it to be. About 2 months after we split, I tried making my grandmother's stew, the one Micah had learned, the one I hadn't been able to look at since he left. Mostly because I was hungry and tired of ordering food. Nothing more sentimental than that going in. I made it wrong. Not wrong in taste, exactly. Wrong in the way you make something when you're only going through the motions of a memory instead of actually being present inside it. I stood in my kitchen and cried harder than I had at any single point during the actual breakup. Because I finally understood, all at once, standing over a pot that tasted like nothing, that the problem had never really been boredom, or Theo, or even the threesome itself, not at its root. The problem was that somewhere along the way I had quietly decided that being loved completely felt like standing still, and instead of learning to sit inside that feeling and trust it, I had gone looking for anything that made me feel like I was moving again, even if moving meant walking straight through the one thing in my life that had ever actually been worth staying still for. I started seeing a therapist not long after that. I want to be specific about that distinction, because I think jumping straight into someone new at that point would have just been the same old restlessness, wearing a slightly different face. It took months of genuinely uncomfortable, unglamorous work to understand why good had never once felt like enough for me, not just in this relationship, but going back further than that, into patterns I'd never bothered to look at honestly before, because looking at them honestly required admitting things about myself I'd rather not have known. I won't pretend I have it all figured out even now, months later, but I understand the shape of it in a way I never did before, and understanding the shape of a thing is at least the beginning of learning not to repeat it. I also, eventually, wrote Micah one letter. I didn't send it hoping for anything back, and I told him that explicitly in the first line, because I didn't want him reading it braced for some request. I just needed him to have, in writing, in my own words, the same thing I'd said at the kitchen table that night, that none of it had ever been his fault for asking for something honest. I don't know if it helped him. I never asked. Some things you have to say without needing to know what they did on the other end. Micah did his own work too, separately, in his own time, in ways I only found out about much later, secondhand, the way you eventually learn about someone's life once you're no longer the person they tell things to first. He leaned hard on his friends, the ones who'd apparently known before I did that something was off, quietly worried on his behalf. He took time off from dating entirely for a stretch, which people around him worried about at the time, but which I think now, with distance, was exactly the right instinct. He needed to remember who he was outside of us before he could reasonably trust himself inside anything new. Here's where most stories like this one end, with two people who can't be in the same room together, who trade what they had for permanent silence and bitterness. One of them cast forever as the villain in the other's retelling, and the other cast forever as the victim who never quite moves past it. That's not what happened to us. And I think that's the actual reason I'm telling you any of this at all. It took the better part of a year before Micah and I were even capable of a normal conversation in the same space. We ran into each other, unplanned, at a mutual friend's gathering. The same kind of loud, crowded, too many people setting where we'd first met, which felt almost unbearably on the nose when it actually happened. I nearly didn't go that night, because I didn't trust myself to be in a room with him without either falling apart or making the whole evening about my own guilt instead of his healing, which would have been its own small selfishness dressed up as remorse. I went anyway, because avoiding him forever had started to feel like its own particular kind of cowardice, one more thing I'd be doing for my own comfort instead of anyone's actual good. He looked good, not good for someone who went through a bad breakup. Good, actually, uncomplicatedly good, lighter than I remembered him even in our happiest months. Like he'd set down some weight he hadn't even fully known he was carrying. And not all of it, I suspect, had anything to do with me. He was seeing someone new. I met the guy briefly, in passing, near the drinks table, and there was nothing performative in the ease between them. The way he laughed at something Micah said, unguarded, immediate, exactly the way I used to laugh at Micah's dumb, ferocious board game trash talk. I felt something complicated watching that from across the room, a real mix of grief and genuine, uncomplicated happiness for him, both at once, and I've since learned, mostly through actual practice, that both of those things are allowed to live in the same chest at the same time without canceling each other out. Micah found me near the end of the night, out on the porch, away from the noise and the rest of the party. We didn't rehash any of it. We'd both, separately, already done enough of that particular work with other people, in other rooms, over many other months, and neither of us seemed to want to spend our first real conversation in over a year picking the same scabs again. He just said, quietly, leaning against the railing, that he was glad I looked like I was actually doing okay. Not performing okay. Actually okay. And I told him the same thing, and meant every word of it, with none of the old ache underneath it that I'd half expected to still be sitting there, waiting. For what it's worth, he said, right before he went back inside. I don't regret asking. Just so you know, I've thought about that a lot, whether I would, looking back, and I still don't. I regret a lot of things about how it all went after. I don't regret that specific conversation on the couch. I told him I didn't either, and for the first time since that Thursday night, I actually meant it completely, without any of the old guilt trying to reframe it as an excuse. I'm not going to tell you we're best friends now, texting every day, some tidy sitcom ending where all the damage gets neatly undone, and we end up at each other's birthday parties for the rest of our lives. That's not this story, and honestly I don't think that ending would even be the right one for us. What I will tell you is this. We are both genuinely in good places now. Not together, we're never going to be together again, and I've made real, complete peace with that, in a way that took actual unglamorous work to arrive at, rather than just time passively doing the job for me. But both of us, separately, on our own timelines, ended up somewhere better than the two people who sat at that kitchen table the night everything finally came apart. So no, the threesome didn't ruin my life. I did that part myself, in everything that came after it, in 2 months of small, deniable choices that quietly added up to something enormous. What that weekend actually did was surface a restlessness in me that had already been sitting there, patient, waiting for a door to eventually walk through. It ended something that, in hindsight, might have needed to end regardless, eventually, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything either of us walked into that weekend expecting. It just happened to be that door, and not some other one. I used to think ruin was the end of a story. I genuinely don't think that anymore. Sometimes ruin is just the place where you finally have to start becoming someone better than the person who caused it. And if you're lucky, and you actually do the work, instead of waiting around for time to quietly paper over it for you, both people standing on either side of the wreckage get to end up somewhere good. Just not anymore, in the same place. And I've come to believe that's allowed to be its own kind of happy ending, even if it doesn't look like the one either of us pictured on that couch. I've replayed that Thursday night in my head more times than I can count. Not because I think I can change what happened. I can't. Some stories don't give you another ending. They just give you another lesson. If there's one thing I hope you take away from mine, it's this. Sometimes the biggest mistakes don't arrive all at once. They arrive disguised as small choices that don't feel important until you add them together. I'm genuinely curious where you landed by the end of this. When this story started, who did you think was going to be the villain? And after hearing everything, Did your opinion change? I don't think there's one right answer. I just know this story starts a conversation every single time it's told. Maybe that's why I finally told it. Take care of the people who make your ordinary days feel extraordinary, and I'll see you in the next story. If you love this story, or this story made you laugh, made your heart race, or gave you butterflies even once, do me one small favor. Hit the like button. It tells YouTube that this is a story worth sharing, and it helps more BL fans discover this little corner of the internet. And that's what keeps me going. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because I upload brand new BL stories filled with romance, comedy, drama, and plenty of heart. And if you know someone who would absolutely obsess over this story, share it with them. I'd love to know what you thought too. Who was your favorite character? What was your favorite scene? Or tell me what kind of BL story you want me to bring to life next. I read your comments, and a lot of my future stories are inspired by what you ask for. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you, Zaddies, in the next story.